so you can get an idea of who Davon is, and I'll bring him on. He's actually here with me in the room today, so he'll be hopping on my iPad. So it'll be some magic that happens before I hop off. So Davon Love is a Baltimore-based political organizer and the Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, LBS. In 2010, Love co-founded LBS, one of the many organizations that successfully pressured the state of Maryland to disband its plans to build a juvenile jail downtown. LBS has also led legislative efforts to increase civilian oversight of law enforcement in Maryland and was a key force in fighting to get bail reform in Maryland and facing off with the bail bonds industry that opposed reforms. Davon is also the author of Worse Than Trump, The American Plantation, a book that offers an important alternative to the exploitative relationship that Black people have to white institutions. Davon is also author of When Baltimore Awakes, which is a comprehensive critique of the way white supremacy is embedded into the human and social service sector in Baltimore. So I'm going to bring Davon on to talk about LBS's legislative agenda and just get you generally caught up about some of the public safety items in the state of Maryland. So I'll pop off and he'll pop on. So just give me 1 second.
All right, everybody. I'm Davon Love, as Adam mentioned, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Pleasure to be with you all this evening. And one of the particular reasons why, I want to just speak some words of appreciation for the Chamber is because I think a lot of times when we think about social justice work, the importance of, Black business and its relationship to the larger ecosystem of our community, often is missing. And so one of the things that I'm going to do is towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to make some connections between the police accountability work and criminal justice work that we'll be doing legislatively, and how that connects to just the larger economic dynamics that will be relevant to an institution like the Greater Baltimore Black Chamber of Commerce. So let me just start just with some general background about the nature of police accountability, and just give people a general sense of what that means. I'm sure, we've all been inundated over the past several years, and particularly over the past few months, with, national narratives about police brutality. And we often get a variety of different explanations in terms of, what causes it, what are the mechanisms that are necessary to address police accountability and police brutality. And, one of the things that LBS takes pride in as a local grassroots organization and think tank, we have the ability to synthesize much of the kind of legislative and political aspects to police accountability that will be necessary to effectively solve the problem and even frame the larger scope of the problem. So let me just start briefly with just some general historical context about the relationship between law enforcement and the community, because I think it would then help shape how LBS has determined the kinds of policy priorities on policing that we think are particularly important to elevate. So when we think about the institution of law enforcement in the United States, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, the institution of law enforcement has traditionally been used and has collaborated with forces that have undermined many of our Black social movements. So whether we're talking about the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which when they formed in Oakland, California in October of 1966, a big part of why they formed was to address the issue of police brutality. It's one issue of many that the community has, and they used, law books and guns as a part of the mechanisms they used in order to patrol the police. Whether you think about the counterintelligence program, that was a program targeted at Black liberation movements. So when we look at, for instance, the Church Commission in 1972, which led to disclosures about this illegal program, where federal government agencies were collaborating with local police to frame members of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, for instance, and to describe them as cop killers in ways that would undermine the legitimacy of the organization. In fact, Richard Nixon famously said that by the end of 1969, the Panthers would be eliminated from the United States. So when we think about, and then of course you think about Martin Luther King, right, who was surveilled by the federal government with collaboration with local law enforcement. So you just look at all the major liberation movements. Law enforcement has been a tool and an instrument used in order to undermine our liberation movements. Additionally, it's important for people to be conscious. So a lot of times we say police, but we need to be clear about the institution of the Fraternal Order of Police, right, which is the labor union that represents law enforcement. One of the things that has happened over the past several years is that law enforcement, through the advocacy of the FOP, so in many respects, a publicly financed special interest institution that defends the interest of law enforcement. That's in essence, or a major part of what the FOP does. Police budgets have skyrocketed in the past 50 years. And so we're at a place now in Baltimore, for instance, where public safety, the police, receive about a third of the city's budget. So we broke a few years ago, $500 million, $500 million, which is, again, approximately a third of the city's overall budget. So when we put all of that in context and then add that to then many of the examples of corruption that were highlighted by the 2016 Department of Justice report that was done in response to the killing of Freddie Gray and then the subsequent uprising, we find in there, and I encourage, it's a long report, it's about 170 pages or so, but I encourage everybody to make time to read it because it's hard to really grasp the level of corruption that exists within the institution of policing without thoroughly reading that report and really understanding the extent to which the police department in Baltimore City has engaged in a level of corruption. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to name some of the policies that LBS is going to be focusing on this coming session. And then I'm going to explain why those policies are the ones that are of particular importance. And then, as I mentioned, I'm going to link that back to why it should be particularly relevant to an organization like this. So the first piece of legislation is the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. So the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights was codified in 1974 by the Maryland General Assembly. It's typically framed as a work or a labor agreement to protect the rights of police officers as workers. Part of the problem with this narration is that the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights provides protections for police officers above and beyond their constitutional rights. And more importantly, what it does is that it creates a statutory mechanism by which police exclusively are policing themselves. It prohibits the ability for external entities outside of law enforcement to participate in oversight. So for instance, the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights says that only sworn law enforcement officials can participate in the initial internal investigation of an allegation of misconduct by a police officer. Additionally, only sworn law enforcement can participate in the discipline that exists, or the discipline that is dispensed by the department, right? Now, before 2016, because when the uprising happened, there was a work group that was created and LBS was involved in legislative advocacy. We wanted to require non-police officers, civilians on police trial boards, these kind of administrative hearing boards to determine discipline for police officers. All that we got in 2016 was we were able to remove the prohibition of non-police officers on the trial boards. We wanted to require community and we weren't able to get that. Right. And so that's one of the things that in repealing the LEOBR, it would allow the community to exercise more oversight. Even things like an officer gets 5 business days before they're required to make a statement on the record about an incident that they've been alleged to have engaged in misconduct. So these are examples of the kinds of protections that police get that allow police to police themselves. And any industry that regulates itself is prone for corruption. And again, I think the DOJ, Department of Justice report, which if you go to the Department of Justice's report, they have a section where they list out reports that they've done. Whether we look at the gun trace task force that happened, or that the discovery of it by the public happened about a year or so later. These are just all examples of the extent of the corruption in the police department. And we need community oversight as the greatest deterrent to police corruption and misconduct. Police do the egregious acts that they engage in because they know, based on how the laws are structured, that only other police officers are going to have access to the information and going to be a part of the process of holding them accountable. So that's the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. Second, the Maryland Public Information Act. The Maryland Public Information Act essentially, so the Public Information Act broadly provides the public access to information from governmental agencies. But we have a particular setup. And in Maryland, the Court of Appeals has ruled in the Shell case a few years ago that the investigatory file of a police officer is a personnel file, and therefore the public cannot request access to it. We want to amend the Maryland Public Information Act to allow the public to request information about a police officer's investigatory file. What that will do, a part of why that's important, if you go back again, thinking about the Department of Justice report, there are examples where the DOJ finds internal affairs investigations, right, that were called unsustained, which means they find no cause for acting or discipline against a police officer. But when they look at the file, they see a plethora of evidence that should have suggested action having been taken. But because the public doesn't have access to those files, internal affairs can do whatever it wants to, right? It can have a plethora of evidence and not discipline a police officer because they know those files are not available to the public, right? And so that's why we want to change it so that that kind of information is made available to the public. One of the most egregious, there are lots of stories about this in the DOJ report. One example that I give that I think is really telling, there's a story in the DOJ report about an officer who would, a particular older Black gentleman, every time he saw him would strip search him and would cavity search him. And this happened over a period of many weeks. He filed a complaint, and then the information in the complaint matched the officer, where they were stationed, the description of the officer, and it even mentioned the gentleman in his complaint saying that he was cavity. He used the term, they requested to search my hind parts. It was an older gentleman, right? But the file, when the DOJ looked at it, it was a unsustained complaint, right? So that's an example of why we need the Maryland Public Information Act amended to allow these records to be disclosed to the public. And then last is a statewide use of force standard. So the two things I just mentioned are the kind of administrative side, the kind of institutional side of policing in terms of the ability to discipline. The use of force is on the criminal side, so the ability to effectively prosecute law enforcement officers. Because Maryland doesn't have a unified use of force statute, there's ambiguities about what constitutes excessive force, right? So what we want is a use of force standard that provides clear enough of a line as to what constitutes excessive force to help make the prosecution of officers who engage in excessive force more effective. So those are the major policies that we're going to be advocating for on police accountability this coming session. And we're going to need you all to help us when we put out action alerts, help us to make sure that you all are contacting your legislators and telling them and pressuring them to make sure that they pass these pieces of legislation. We're in a historic moment, but it's still going to require pressure because as a person who's talking to legislators on a regular basis, there's active work being done to try to get around what we really need as a community, because the police department, even though PR-wise, they have pretty low credibility, as an institution, they still have tremendous power. And so we're going to need you all support. Last thing I'll say, so going back to what I said in the beginning, in terms of connecting this to the Black Baltimore Chamber of Commerce, two things I want to say that I think are particularly important in terms of how it relates to policing. One, I mentioned in the beginning, the way that policing drains the budget. So in addition to how much money the city spends in terms of policing, also the settlements, right? The millions of dollars of police settlements that often require the city to pay out taxpayer dollars to folks. And so I think it's of particular importance if we're interested in being able to advocate for more services to our community and provide more opportunities for Black-owned businesses to be able to participate in opportunities with city government, that we're able to provide alternatives to law enforcement that allow us to be able to have more, Black folks to have more business access, more access to capital that's drained by the way that currently the police department and how it's situated in the budget. Lastly, I want to make a public safety argument for police accountability. One of the things that happens too often is that people put police accountability in one category and make it oppositional to public safety. What I want to argue is that, and anyone who's ever talked to police officers or been anywhere proximate to prosecutors or people that are trying to address the issue of murder and homicide, what they will tell you is that if people don't trust the police, then you won't have the information you need to put together a case to go after those who are the drivers of violence and crime in Baltimore City and in any other city that would apply to. So there's a public safety argument here that for those who are serious about the importance of reducing violence in Baltimore City, in terms of, people killing each other in Baltimore City, if the police are going to put away folks that are the drivers of violence, right? Not people that are engaged in, just conflicts to go astray, right? There are a variety of resources and stuff that preventative measures, we need to get to that. But the people who are the drivers of organized crime and violence in Baltimore City, the police do not have the ability to effectively put a case together because all the legislation, the barriers that I just laid out are the kinds of barriers that don't allow the public to have the trust necessary to be able to assist law enforcement in addressing the issue of homicide. So the issue of police accountability is not just about police brutality, it's also about public safety. And public safety is something that if Baltimore is safer, it creates more opportunities for businesses to grow and thrive. Unfortunately, a lot of the white corporate business establishments advocate for the kind of tough on crime policies that just criminalize Black people. And that approach is ultimately not going to, in fact, it's going to harm our community taking that approach. But police accountability is going to help address the issue of violence in ways that are going to be more effective than just throwing everybody in jail. So with that, if there are any, I don't know if we're taking questions now or later on.
Thank you so much, Davon. So we actually will allow room for questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or drop your name in the chat box so that we can call on you. All right, we have a question from Ms. Jones. Make sure that you can speak.
You hear me?
All right, Ms. Jones. Yes, ma'am. We can hear you now.
Yeah, I was just curious with the new election and with the new, hopefully, well, I shouldn't say hopefully, but if Brandon Scott does get that mayor position, is he on the same page with you guys as far as what you're trying to do and how he's going to approach the police situation in Baltimore?
So I think in conversations that I've had with him and in just his previous positions that he's taken, both on the city council and times that he's come to Annapolis, it's my sense that he's been very much aligned with the policies that we put forward. Okay. Now, one thing I want to note is that one of the issues with criminal justice policy is that while we control the kind of local machinery of government, police department, states and all that, the policies that govern it are statewide. And so his support is certainly important and helpful. Okay. But we need, legislators around the state to support the kind of policies that I mentioned that would help lead to what I described earlier.
I see. Okay.
Great question. Thank you so much for that, Ms. Jones. Thank you again, Davon, for everything. Such valuable information. Do we have any other questions?
Hi, Lindsay.
Looking in the chat box. Hi, Curtis.
Hey there. Yeah, I have
Hey,
a question.
how you doing, Curtis?
Hey, Davon, how you doing?
I'm good, man. Good to see you.
Good. I didn't know you had 2 books out there. I'll have to make sure that I read them.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So, a lot of people don't know I'm actually working on a book myself, and it's entitled Beyond Barack, and it's about where we take our community beyond the milestone of having a Black president. And from a political standpoint, we know they've been using the slogan, defund the police, sort of as a cudgel against people who are standing against police brutality. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to know, what is LBS and what is your stand when it comes to the term defunding the police, and what does it mean to you guys?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, because that's actually something that you're going to see a whole lot more from us in 2021. So 2 things. One is that the national movement around defund police comes from conversations about the notion of police abolition and prison abolition. And there's a rich kind of intellectual and political history of police and prison abolition. Now, a lot of people who have been exposed to that tradition find that notion a very fanatical idea, right? And, one of the things that, actually will be putting out in the near future is just some information about non-Western societies that didn't have prisons and police and how they operated. Now, the reason for that is not that we're going to abolish police and prisons tomorrow, right? These are definitely things that are going to require steps to get to because we should see that in an ideal world is a world without prisons and police. My criticism of many of the national folks that have put out this defund police narrative is they haven't done a good job of explaining the mechanics of how that would work. And they haven't done a good job of connecting that to concrete alternatives to address safety. Because as a person who organizes in Baltimore and whose bases Black people in Baltimore, there are people who will say, yeah, police brutality, but I can't get to my door without hearing gunshots, right? And so that's a real legitimate concern that we have to address if we're serious about this idea of what police and prison abolition would mean. So defund police in its best context is like part of the in-between step, because there are ways in which law enforcement are deployed in our community that are better served with other roles. I had a conversation with a gentleman a few months ago who was an understudy of Walter Carter, who's the father of current state senator Joe Carter, who's a famous civil rights activist in Baltimore City, who was also a social worker. And one of the things that the gentleman told me was that, in fact, in the 70s, apparently there was an auxiliary within the 911 complex where if there were issues that were non-emergency, that they would call on this set of professionals, right? So domestic disputes, drug overdoses, right? So those kinds of things, you can have an entirely different auxiliary whose job it is to respond to those. And it would be cost effective for the city, right? And it would be a more appropriate response. And so what defund police should be about, again, in its best context, is how do we take the functions that police are currently serving, that they're ineffective at, and how do we move it to places that actually are empowering of the community and give the community alternative relationship to law enforcement that is more equitable, right? And so I think that's a process. Again, that's not going to happen overnight. It's a process. It requires really deep reading of the budget because there's labor issues there too. There's lots of pension and benefits commitments that are in the police budget that require, really sophisticated, adjustments to the budget in terms of how it actually be carried out. I was actually disappointed with some of the activism back in June around cutting the police budget. I thought in many ways it was done irresponsibly because one of the things that they cut was the crime lab, which to me, if you're going to cut, that's not the place in terms of getting public support to cut. So to your point, to the question, so I think when thinking about defunding police, it's about how do we transition certain vital functions out of the hands of law enforcement into a institutional container that the community owns that can respond to the needs of our community and allow police to be the last resort. Ultimately, police should be, if people are shooting, people are in real harm, police should be the last resort. Unfortunately, currently, they're the first resort.
Got it. Understood. Thanks for that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. We have time for maybe one more question. I don't quite see any hands up. Mr. Harris, Mr. or Mrs. Harris, I do apologize. You asked for a link, Mr. Love, if you want to address that, if you want to let us know which link you're looking for so that we can make sure that you receive that. Awesome.
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
I don't know
Mr.
which.
Love.
I was just saying I don't know which, if they're looking for the DOJ report. I don't have it on hand. But if you go to the Department of Justice's website, there's a tab that has their reports, and it should be pretty easy to find.
So hopefully that will be helpful. And if not, we'll still be here in the chat box for the remainder of the meeting to make sure that you can receive that information. We have another question right here in the chat from Mr. Tillman. What are 2 things the Black business community can do to help?
I would say, 2 things. The biggest one is, reach out to your legislators when we put out the action alerts. You know, when they see a diversity of different kinds of folks and institutions come out and support, it makes a big difference, because legislators, what they care about the most is getting elected again, right? And so if they see a business that touches a lot of people, you know, they're going to react differently, and it helps us do our advocacy. I guess the second thing I would say is, you know, LBS has a lot of materials, written materials about the work that we've done, about our, you know, issues of police accountability. So, you know, businesses, you know, I guess, you know, currently given the pandemic, you know, it's a little bit more difficult. But any way that your business can help promote some of the, because one of the things we pride ourselves on is we actually have some pretty comprehensive written material on the issues of police accountability and some of our other legislative work. And so, you know, any way that Black businesses can help circulate that will be helpful. Let me add one thing that I actually wanted to mention before, and we don't have time to get into it. We've been advocating for, you know, one of the things that has come up a lot over the past several years is the legalization of cannabis, of marijuana. And LBS has taken a position, because we're not necessarily people that are big, you know, weed smokers ourselves, but we understand that it's a political inevitability that, you know, recreational cannabis is going to become legalized. So we've actually been advocates for the tax revenues going back into the communities most impacted by the war on drugs. My hope is that and we actually supported a piece of legislation this past session that created a fund for Black businesses off the revenues of medical cannabis. So that's something that at some point we'll probably come back and talk to you all about. It's something that I think more directly impacts a lot of the, you know, the constituencies in this call. But that's something that LBS will be active on this coming session as well. It may pass the session, it may not, but it's something that we're going to continue to press for, to make sure that if they're going to legalize cannabis, we want to make sure those tax revenues don't just go back into the general budget. They need to come back to our communities so we can use those resources to repair the harm that was done by the war on drugs.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Davon, for everything that you've contributed to us tonight. I know that I found all of your information very, very valuable, and I'm sure that our audience did too. If we don't have any more questions, we just want to say thank you again on behalf of the chamber. And we're actually going to turn it back to Mr. Jackson to introduce our second speaker for tonight.
All right, thank you all. You all take care.
You too.
And I'm back.
Hey, Adam, this is Doug. You don't have to read my whole bio, man.
You're like, oh man, you just read the first
I
couple
can handle some of it.
Gotcha.
All right.
Well, I appreciate Davon for speaking to us tonight. And also, if anyone else wants to find out any of that information, you can actually go to the LBS website, lbsbaltimore.com. Just FYI. But our second speaker is Mr. Doug Mayer from a group called Marylanders for Tax Fairness. Did I get that right, Doug?
Yeah, that's right.
So the abridged bio for Doug is Doug Mayer.
Good stuff, man.
Doug Mayer is a partner with Strategic Partners Media, is a highly skilled political strategist and a veteran communicator with more than 15 years of experience working in the political communications sector, including 3 successful Republican governors. He could talk to you about all the other great things in his resume, as I'm sure he will tonight. But I'll bring him on right now to talk about an effort that he's working on called Marylanders for Tax